All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to my roof deck on this bright and sunny Chicago day. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about some Supreme Court rulings from last week. The Supreme Court ended its term last week, and they handed down some pretty big rulings. And I wanted to talk about how those rulings can be related towards disability rights. I specifically wanted to talk about the ruling made by the Supreme Court in the case that was brought in West Virginia about West Virginia's ban of trans athletes to participate in women's sports. And the Supreme Court, in their ruling, which I think is a very bad ruling, they ruled that yes, West Virginia is allowed to ban trans women from participating in women's sports. Now, I think this is a bad ruling. Trans women are women. They can play in women's sports. But I also wanted to talk and highlight this ruling because I think could be a harbinger for rulings to come, that if they reach the Supreme Court and tell us how the Supreme Court might rule in those cases. And what I wanted to talk specifically about is about a lawsuit against that was brought by Texas to try to end Section 504. Now, Section 504 is part of the Rehabilitation Act, and the Rehabilitation Act is one of the seminal pieces of legislation that adds rights and protections for people with disabilities in the United States. It was signed in 1973 by Richard Nixon, and Richard Nixon, who was very famously a Republican, was not really happy about signing that law. He thought there were questions about how they were going to fund that law, which is a question that Republicans always have whenever they just don't want to do something. So Richard Nixon signed into this law, and in that law there is a section called Section 504. Section 504 essentially guarantees the rights of people with disabilities to receive accommodations in the community. So what in practice this does is in public spaces or and in places of employment at schools, people with disabilities have the right to receive accommodations there. And so this could be anything from someone that has a physical disability having an access ramp or an elevator that they can use to navigate the building, or someone that has a peanut allergy having a peanut-free place where they can sit and eat their lunches, to in schools, people that have their academics impacted by their disability, they have the right to receive accommodations in their academic settings. Things like maybe extended time or more frequent check-ins by a teacher, things like that, to ensure that they are successful and they don't get held back by their disability, by the way that people treat their disability. Now, this is a law that has not really been popular with Republicans and Republican administrations. Like I said, the Nixon administration did not really want to implement this law, even though he signed it. It took sit-ins in 1977 in order to actually get Section 504 implemented. These sit-ins took place 4 years after that law was signed. During the Reagan administration as well, Section 504 was under attack by the Reagan administration, who, again, Republicans don't want to pay for anything. That's always the excuse that when they don't want to do something. The Reagan administration tried to limit and cut back on Section 504. In some ways, they were successful. They brought a challenge to the courts that limited where Section 504 could be applicable, like it limited the impact of that law. So that is a little bit of a very brief overview of the history of that law. And at this point, you might be asking yourself, how does this pertain to a case about trans rights in West Virginia? And what happened under the Biden administration? Even though there were efforts by Republican administrations to limit Section 504 and its impact, there have also been efforts to broaden it and make sure that it services more people. And one of those efforts took place under the Biden administration, who extended the protections of Section 504 to include what was termed gender-based disability. Now, I don't think being trans is a disability. I don't think that it should be considered a disability. I think the people that consider it a disability are saying that for nefarious needs. But by the Biden administration doing that, expanding protections under Section 504 to gender-based disabilities. What that did is it extended the protections of the rights and accommodations for people who were transgender, for trans people, to also receive those same protections as people with disabilities. So overall, on balance, I think it was a pretty good thing that happened. Now, shortly after that happened, in 2024, Texas decided that they were going to sue. They did not like this. The Republican Party right now has largely replaced animosity towards abortion with the animosity towards trans people. And so Texas was like, we're going to sue. We don't like that the Biden administration is going to try to cover the rights and protections of trans people under this law. However, they didn't just sue to limit the protections to exclude trans people, which would be bad. That would be bad in itself. They didn't just do that. What Texas is arguing is that the entire law is unconstitutional, that the entire law of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act needs to be struck down, that people with disabilities should not be entitled to accommodations and protections in the community, and that states should not be under any obligation to provide those accommodations. And I think the takeaway here is that Republicans have had this goal of limiting or ending Section 504 basically since they signed it. They signed it into law, and since then they have been trying to reduce its impact, trying to limit what it does, or now just seems to be to get rid of it altogether. After Texas filed that lawsuit, several states led by Republicans that had, especially in the Republican-dominated states where they have a Republican governor, Republican Congress, or Republican legislature and Republican judiciary, they joined that lawsuit. They were saying, we agree with Texas. We do not think that people with disabilities should receive the same protections under 504. We think that 504 should be struck down. Again, not great. And pretty clearly it's a case of the Republican Party trying to leverage antipathy towards trans people to strike down protections for people with disabilities. I do want to bring up that it's not all bad news. As of late, a couple of states have dropped off of that lawsuit. Indiana and Kansas have dropped off of that lawsuit. They have said that they are no longer going to be a part of that lawsuit going forward, which is a good thing. And I think it's a sign to show that we are winning this fight, that we are winning this battle. Republican policies, Republican goals are often unpopular with the broad public. And once they start to get implemented, people push back, and people have been pushing back against this lawsuit. However, it's still running through the courts, which means we don't know how the courts are going to rule, and judging by the makeup of the Supreme Court, if this lawsuit makes it to the Supreme Court, there's a chance that they overturn Section 504, which would be a really devastating blow for people with disabilities. So what can we do? We can organize, we can participate in our elections, we can vote, we can spread this word to people in our community. If you know people that are voting Republican, but they are advocates for people with disabilities, they should know what Republicans are trying to do with the Section of 504. And we can just keep up the pressure. Again, Indiana and Kansas dropped off of this lawsuit, which shows that the pressure that we put on our politicians works. They don't want to be held accountable by us. They want to stay in office. And so when we pressure them, they tend to do what we tell them to do. Why is this important? This is important because disability comes for us all. Every single one of us will be impacted by disability at some point in our lives, whether that's through circumstances at birth, whether that is through an accident or injury, whether that's through an illness, whether that is through the process of aging. Every single one of us will be afflicted with a disability at some point. And we will all need those protections in Section 504. We will all need those rights that are guaranteed in Section 504. And so if we don't push back against them now, then we are all at risk of losing them. And Something that is very important that I have come to understand over the past couple of years is that the only way for us to protect our own rights, especially if we are in positions of power, especially if we are represented in the majorities of our government, the only way that we can protect our own rights is to vigorously stand up for the rights of others, to vigorously defend the rights of people that are different from us. There's a very famous poem about that. If you like this video, please consider giving it a like, give me a subscribe, give me a follow, ask me a question, and I'll be happy to answer any questions people have in the future. Until then, stay tuned.